Hi and welcome to the channel. Today I want to talk to you about this patch here. This patch is part of the new collection of patches for the Grandmother released by Moog and Lisa Bella Donna, and it showcases several techniques and tricks to use the Grandmother modules in a very unusual creative way. This patch is composed of several sound layers, and you can see that when I engage with the mod wheel here, a lot of things happens to the sound. But if you have been following this channel, the exercise I'm proposing today is similar to a video that we had before, which is lessons from Moog applied to Hydrasynth. And the purpose of this exercise is not only to understand what the Moog patch is doing, but is also to put to the test that claim that techniques and lessons that you can learn from one synthesizer can be applied to other synthesizers with same capabilities. So this is in essence a sound design exercise. And the idea, of course, is not to completely mimic one synthesizer into another or an analog into a digital, but it's more to try to apply the same techniques respecting some characteristics or spices of each platform. So without further ado, let's start by understanding the Moog patch by Lisa Bella Donna. The first thing that calls my attention here when I first listened to this patch is this siren effect that seems to speed up or accelerate when I engage with a keynote, but also once I start to interact with a mod wheel, the siren becomes a burst of laser beams, right? So in order to understand what is going on here, I want to start looking into the envelope. If you have watched our previous video, you will also see that Lisa Bella Donna has this look upon the envelope, not as only controlling the dynamics of the amplitude of the wave or the volume of the sound to mimic like brass timbre or strings, but she rather uses the envelope with very long attack, decay and release times to create this evolving modulation of the sound. So at the core of this patch lays the envelope. But let's look into those siren/laser effects. In order to focus on this, what I will do is to mute my oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 from the mixer. And this will let us only with a siren/laser sound. And what she's showcasing here is something you see on the Moog's menu, that when you set the resonance of the filter above 12 o'clock here and set the keyboard track to 1:1, the Moog filter will self-oscillate as if in a sine wave. And by setting the keyboard track, I can actually play this oscillation. And for every octave that I go above here on the keyboard, I'm actually affecting the cutoff frequency on the filter and essentially its pitch, the pitch of this sine wave modulation. So my filter becomes a sine wave oscillator here. But it's not only this. You can hear that it's not only the keyboard that is affecting my pitch, but I have this siren effect. And what is giving this effect to the sound is the envelope amount set up here. And what this is doing, or what this is telling to the system, is to use the values from the envelope to affect the cutoff frequency as well. So this very long attack, decay and release phase is actually also modulating the pitch of my self-oscillating filter here. And that's why you get this siren effect pitch modulation. It is actually from the envelope. But how does she achieve this laser sound effect when I engage the mod wheel? This is done by actually sending the negative envelope signal all the way to control the rate of the LFO in the modulation section here. Therefore, when the envelope phase was supposed to be raising, since we are sending the negative envelope, what will happen is that the speed of my LFO will decrease the higher my envelope phase will be. So let's look at this LED here while I hold the note. And you will see how it starts to blink slower the longer I hold the note here. But as soon as I enter on the release phase and this value starts to go close to 0, the speed starts to increase here, since what we are using there is the negative value of the envelope. So when the release phase comes, the values are actually raising. So this solves the first part of the puzzle, but how does the siren become a laser? And that's another clever trick upon her sleeve here. Lisa Bella Donna is routing the LFO modulation to the cutoff frequency by turning the cutoff amount here in the modulation panel. And what this does is sending voltage to the cutoff input here and basically modulating my cutoff frequency from the set frequency in the knob upwards in a ramp saw at the rate of the LFO. So that when I get the mod wheel engaged, this cutoff amount here is basically turning this knob at that frequency. And that's where the lasers comes from. If I don't change my cutoff frequency over time, I just get the pure sine wave. So now let's look into a second layer of this sound. In order to isolate here only oscillator 1, I will crank it back in the mixer all the way up, but I will now set my resonance here on the filter to 0, which will stop it from self-oscillating. Now what we are hearing is just oscillator 1. So let's try to understand what is going on here. The simple part of oscillator 1 is that she's sending the oscillator 1 wave out into a high pass filter, and this is going back to oscillator 1 in on the mixer. This is simply applying high pass filter to oscillator 1, which is set to pulse at 16 feet here, but the dynamics that you hear from the sound again is coming from our envelope. Notice that she patches the positive value of the envelope all the way to the pulse width modulation in, meaning that the frequency of the pulse width modulation is varying according to the raise of attack, decay and release phases on the envelope here. So let's listen to that. The longer I hold the note, not only the louder the sound is, but also the roar of the pulse width modulation increases. Right, you get this longer interval between the pulse width. And not only that, you might have noticed that when I engage the mod wheel here, I get this effect of a bouncing sound that engages or interacts really well with the spring reverb here, giving this metallic flavor to it. And what's going on here is type of routing in the Moog Grandmother, which is to turn this cutoff amount knob to be affected also by the LFO. Meaning that when I engage the mod wheel here, the LFO on the rhythm of this blinking light is turning the cutoff frequency knob on the filter from its cutoff position upwards and backwards in a sawtooth motion. So by engaging the mod wheel here, what I'm doing is actually interacting with the cutoff frequency of the filter, and that's why it also collaborates to listening more to the PWM roar the longer I hold a note here. Very interesting effect. And what is building up here is this tension. The longer I hold the notes, the more aggressive the sound is becoming. So let's have a look at the third layer here, our third sound source, which is the oscillator 2. Let me mute oscillator 1 in the mixer and pull oscillator 2 all the way up. Let's have a listen to it. You might have noticed a difference here between oscillator 1 and oscillator 2, more than that oscillator 2 is set to a triangular wave in another octave. When I press and hold a note, independently of the position of the mod wheel, this sound is responding to the LFO much more than what happened in oscillator 1. And this is because she's sending the LFO waveform all the way to the attenuator, and this is coming back into oscillator 2 linear frequency modulation here. So even if I don't have the mod wheel engaged, the LFO is changing the sound or the modulation of oscillator 2 here. And again in oscillator 2, we follow that pattern that the longer I hold a note, the more aggressive it gets, to the point of almost clipping and saturation here. So what this linear modulation is doing as the envelope values go up, or in this case go down, since we are sending the negative value to modulate the LFO here, the harsher linear FM becomes, almost distorting the sound as a overdrive saturation there. This all contributes to the fact that, or behavior of this patch, that the longer I will hold the notes, the more they will bite, the more aggressive they will be. So let's layer these sounds back again by bringing in oscillator 1 and cranking the resonance to make the filter self-oscillate again. And of my own accord, I would also like to add some noise to it. It's a very interesting soundscape, like you would expect from Lisa Bella Donna, and she's really potentializing the modulation capabilities of these simple modules here when she's sending this very long attack decay release envelope, both in its negative shape and positive shape, to control the classic LFO modulation rate here, so that the speed will vary along the time, and the same envelope is controlling the filter that is self-oscillating. You have an opening and closing of the filter here controlled by the LFO, so you have this loop here for which the envelope is the core modulation, and those are affecting both the pulse width modulation for oscillator 1 and the linear frequency modulation for oscillator 2. As a result, you get this behavior of a sound that gets more and more intense the longer you hold a note, and some, I would call it side effects, which is this feeling that you have a motor that is accelerating, right? Because of this pitch raise. And look what happens when I trigger a note several times. The feeling you get is that you are spinning this motor faster and faster. And that's a type of interaction with a patch that I had never felt before. Of course, you can also use the time to do that. But this idea that the more you press, the more you spin the wheel, it's a super interesting and cool feeling while engaging with this patch. Another thing that I'm not showcasing too much here is that she added glide in the transition, and this could also represent cool ways of playing the patch when you use the monophonic note priority here. But if I play it on this way, then the envelope is not re-triggered. So the first note that I hold is dictating the envelope phase progression here. So the sound gets harsher and harsher even if I'm playing other notes here. Very cool sound, very interactive patch, really exploring what these modules can do in combination to one another. But now let's see if we can apply these lessons, these tricks to another platform, and how will this sound? Come with me. Well, trying to do this exercise to port the patch from the Moog into the Hydrasynth. One of my first intentions was to try to control the sound of the siren or the self-oscillating filter in the patch. So if we listen to the original patch from the Moog, this raising sound here, it's very loud in the mix. It's up front in comparison to the other sound sources. But when trying to tame this sound or control the volume of it, I realized that if you are playing the filter, you don't have access to how loud this sound will be from your mixer like you would do with the other sound sources. So my first take while trying to reproduce this patch in the Hydrasynth was actually to use my third oscillator as this sine wave oscillation, and then try to apply the same envelope that is controlling the whole modulation and sound to change the pitch of my sine wave. But this approach didn't work out because the values you get from your envelope will never achieve this big range in pitch that you get when you are actually modulating the filter. I think this was one of the first lessons while trying to apply the theory, so to say, from the previous patch into practice in this platform here. And this was the first insight that when trying to figure out why is so that the pitch range here is so much higher when I'm playing the filter than playing a regular oscillator, The only conclusion that I could come upon with was that if we are playing a self-oscillating filter here by cranking its resonance all the way to the top, what we are actually doing is feeding back the signal into the filter to emphasize the cutoff frequency, and for every feedback iteration you actually get this peak higher and higher and higher in a constructive interference. And I completely missed that characteristic just by listening to the patch and trying to analyze what was going on in the Moog. It was only when I sat down and tried to replicate this patch into the Hydra that I got such an insight. And then of course I learned a lot about Hydra itself and how things are routed here, because when you try to interpret the language or the way it's done in another synth to a new one, you always bump into the differences of names and how the modulation is thought through in terms of system architecture. If you want to try to reproduce this patch in the Hydrasynth, follow me and I will give you a walkthrough of all parameters I have set here, and I tell you a little bit more about my insights while doing so. If you've been following this channel, I always like to start by the voice menu here. First thing, you will set your voice polyphony to monophonic so that we mimic the same behavior of the Moog here. As well, trying to get closer to that warmer sound of the analog, I changed analog FL to 88. Set the random phase to on, and this will mimic that analog oscillator behavior that makes the oscillator vibrate independently of any trigger. So when you hit a key and your amplifier opens up, you might be in any phase of the wave. And I have also set warm mode here on, get us closer to analog sound. On page 2 here, the important parameters to change is to set the vibrato amount to 0. What this does is that in general in the Hydrasynth, when you start a new patch, it has this extra LFO vibrating at this frequency here that is modulating the pitch of your oscillators, and we don't want to have this pitch modulation for this sound here. Last but not least, on the voicing page, I have changed the glide time to 16 and set the glide legato to on. So now, following the signal path here, let's have a look into our sound sources. You know that the Moog patch has 3 different sound sources, 2 oscillators and a filter that is self-oscillating. So let's have a look at oscillator 1 first, and that's the one that will receive pulse width modulation. Therefore, I set it to a square wave, tuned to -13 semitones, and I have used beat redux to 5 to try to give more texture to the pulse width modulation here. Key track is set all the way to 100%. If I just follow the signal path here, on MUTANT 1 you'll see the modulation applied to oscillator 1. So I have chosen pulse width squeeze with a feedback of 33%, ratio of 1, a depth of 64, and all wet in 100%. If we now look into oscillator 2, this is our triangular wave, and the tuning here is set to semi-11 and -10 cents. I'm not using any bit redux here, and full key track at 100%. And this is the oscillator that will receive the ring modulation. So let's have a look at MUTANT 1 here, where I have set linear frequency modulation with a little tweak here. This is the first time in the Hydra that I'm using a patch cable to complete a patch, and this is because I was trying to send my LFO rate as the source of my frequency modulation here to simulate that cable that we have in the Moog patch, connecting the LFO wave into the input for the frequency modulation of oscillator 2. However, I cannot by default find the LFO as a source for my frequency modulation, so I had to do a workaround here, but I'll talk more about that when we discuss our mod matrix. My depth is set to 73.4, dry wet all the way to 100%. If we follow the signal chain here on the mixer, my 2 oscillators are set to the maximum volume of 128, both oscillator 1 and 2. And now we can talk about our third sound source, which is our self-oscillating filter. My choice for the filter 1 here was a low-pass filter FAT24 to mimic or get closer to the Moog ladder filter, and I have found the sweet spot for the cutoff frequency around 57.5. Remember that the cutoff frequency here is also dictating the pitch of our self-oscillating filter, our third sound source. So I've tried to fine-tune this so that the Hydra and the Moog would have a similar tuning. You also have to crank the resonance all the way to 128 so that you will cause the filter to self-oscillate. And that's the basis for our siren sound that gives the flavor of this patch here. On filter 2 here, my values are set to low pass, notch, high pass for the type of filter. I have actually morphed the between low pass and notch to a value of 33, and I can tell you more about that when we discuss the overall sound design for this patch. My cutoff frequency for this second filter is set to 112.9. Notice that I'm not having key track neither resonance for the second filter. If we now go to the amplifier section, you'll see my amplifier volume, and you will notice that I'm not directly routing neither the LFO or velocity to the amp levels. But what I'm doing is actually making use of envelope 2 that is pre-connected to the amplifier as that main envelope that will dictate the modulation for this whole patch. So let's have a look at envelope 2 now, and you can see here the curves in our envelope scheme, and that's also mimicking the natural behavior of the Moog Grandmother. My values landed on attack 8.19, decay 9.21, sustain to 58.2, release around 12 seconds. I haven't messed up with the values in the second row, but if we go to the second page, you will see that the attack curve lies in log 28, decay curve in exponential 43, and the release curve to exponential 42. But not only that, legato is set to off, and I've also set reset to off, and that's what gave me that characteristic that every time I would press a note, I will get this acceleration effect just like the original patch. Free run is set to off as well as envelope loop there. And the last element in our straight signal path here is the reverb. You know that on the Moog Grandmother we have the spring reverb activated the whole time, bringing that foggy atmosphere in the background. So in order to capture the same mood, my choice for a reverb was cloud, since we don't have a spring reverb in the Hydra. But I could use here very long times on the delay. So I've set it to 1.4 seconds, the tone set to 16.4, my high dump to 18.2, I've experimented also with low dump 13.2, and the dry wet set to 91.992 there. And that's what gives us this airy feeling of the background there, having the same function as the spring reverb in the Moog synthesizer. Last but not least, we can have a look at modulation. If you have been watching the channel, you'll know that I tend to create my LFOs and envelopes from the right to the left. So LFO 5 here is having the role of the LFO module in the Moog Grandmother. I have set the waveform here to saw down, just like Grandmother patch. The rate here is set to 6.02, no sync to the BPM, trig sync set to single, no delay, no fade, no phase, but my level is also set to 0, and you will see here when we talk in the mod matrix why is that so. Last but not least, I'm also making use of LFO 4, despite of the fact that in the Moog patch they only have a single LFO module, and this is basically a workaround to achieve the same sound quality we have there that I will explain better when we talk about the mod matrix. But my values for LFO 4 then are set to saw wave down at a rate of 4 Hz, the trig sync set to single, and this one has the level at 69.8. But okay, those are the values for the patch, and now let's go where the magic happens to patch this all together in the mod matrix. The first patch that we'll see here in our mod matrix is envelope 2 controlling the cutoff frequency of filter 1 here. If you remember, envelope 2 is that long envelope that is controlling the amplifier volume, but also is the root of all of our modulation. What this is representing in the Moog is the envelope amount knob in the filter section that is set to a positive value. The second patch you will find here in my mod matrix is the same envelope 2 now controlling the rate of LFO 5, which will be responsible for the modulation of the second oscillator and also to create the laser effect. Notice that I'm sending a negative 6.2 value, and this patch here represents the cable in the Moog going from the negative envelope values all the way to control the LFO rate in the modulation section. And if you remember, on the modulation section for the Moog Grandmother, we also have the cutoff amount knob that connects the LFO 5 to the cutoff frequency of filter 1 here, and the value I'm using is 63.5. If we now go to page 2, you'll see the connection I've made reassigning the mod wheel to control the level of LFO 5, and what this is responsible for is transforming the siren effect into the laser effects. And that's the reason why my LFO 5 here was set to a level of 0, because I wanted to control that influence from the mod wheel. But this solution brought me to a new problem that I will tell you when we talk about the FM modulation here. My last patch in this page was connecting envelope 2 to MUTANT 1 def, and MUTANT 1, if you remember, is the pulse width modulation rate for oscillator 1, and I have set the MUTANT 1 def to 44 points here. If we now move to page 3 in our mod matrix, you'll see our last 2 patches. And this was actually my workaround for the modulation on oscillator 2. The fact that I have chosen to use LFO 5 level to control the influence between the Sirens and Lazers here turn this LFO off. Therefore, I could not use the very same LFO to create this repetition pulse that you hear on my oscillator 2 there. So since we are in the Hydra and LFOs is an abundant resource here, I simply borrowed LFO 4 to be modulating my MUTANT 3 here, or the ring modulation. Bear with me, that one is a little bit complicated now, because like I told you before, I could not route the ring modulation on MUTANT 3 to have a source directly connected to an LFO. So what I had to do, my workaround here, was to actually send the CV voltage of the LFO to my modulation out all the way up on my patch bay, and then I used a patch cable to connect this back so that I could access in the linear FM here on MUTANT 3 my LFO modulation. Kind of a big workaround, I know. Let's recap. I could not use LFO 5 to create the ring modulation in oscillator 2 since I was routing that level of the LFO to the mod wheel. So I had to create a second LFO just to control my oscillator 2. But since I cannot route my LFO rate directly into the MUTANT source here, I had to, in the mod matrix, send my LFO 4 to my patch bay output 1, and then I could access that control voltage as a source for frequency modulation. So it's a little trick here. If you want to patch your ring modulation to LFOs, you have that option, this workaround, to actually send your LFO as CV and putting it back into your CV inputs there. And then you have access from your MUTANT here to your LFO. And last but not least, I'm also sending the envelope 2 negative value all the way to my LFO 4, because if you remember in the original patch, every modulation was pulsating according to LFO 5, and that is being controlled by the envelope. So that's why I also have to duplicate not only the LFO 5 into LFO 4, but I also had to make that relation with the main envelope to control the rate of LFO. If you have survived this long explanation, I have one last reflection for you here in relation to that idea of how to mix the self-oscillating filter in a better way. And the fact that in the Hydrasynth I have the possibility to apply 2 different low-pass filters to my signal chain, and the fact that I use the filters in series there, so after the first filter that is self-oscillating I can apply a second filter. In the Hydrasynth I actually got more control over the volume or how much of these high frequencies coming from the siren effect will end up in my final mix. So by changing the cutoff frequency of my second filter there, I could actually lower down a little the volume of the lasers and the siren in the overall mix. Well, this is it for that patch. The big takeaway for me is that it is different when we simply theoretically analyze a patch design than when you really try to recreate these elements or reuse them in other patches, because that's when you really understand the nuances and the deep details of what the sound designer was after on that patch. I hope this was an interesting analysis for you as well, and if you follow the details here, you might have this patch now in your bank. And as always, thanks for watching.